we ask that you bear with us with any technical difficulties that we may encounter. And if you yourself encounter any difficulties, please enter that in the chat feature that is located at the bottom of the screen, and one of our team will assist to help you. So a few more housekeeping details. To get the best experience, we encourage you to view this in speaker view. So in your upper right corner of your screen, you'll see viewing options. If you're seeing Brady Bunch style squares, that is gallery view. You'll want to select speaker view, and that should give you the best presentation experience. I want to thank those of you who have contributed to our programs, our online programming, to help us to continue to bring this type of enriching experience to you on a regular basis. And if you have not yet contributed and are able to, we so appreciate any contributions that enable us to continue bringing you these type of programs. We will share a donation link in the chat if that is something that you're interested in. So on the note of support, I would like to just take a moment to thank our generous program sponsors, Jody and Jeff Starin, from their donor advised fund of the Jewish community, and from the foundation of Betsy Rosenblum and Richard Bookban. Thank you so much for helping to support this program. Now, please allow me to introduce our speaker, Uwe Westphal. Uwe is a writer and historian and lives in Berlin and London. He worked at Penn, later in New York as a journalist and producer for PBS and CBS. In 2017, he published his first novel on the Berlin fashion industry. Uwe spent decades researching the subject of the fashion history in Berlin and the successful participation of Jews between 1836 and 1939. This research led him to archives worldwide and conversations with contemporary witnesses. He published his book, Fashion Metropolis Berlin, the story of the rise and destruction of the Jewish fashion industry, in 2019. Please help me welcome Uwe Westphal.
Good evening all together. Before I start my talk about the history of Jewish fashion firms in Berlin, I think I should tell you a little bit about myself, and in particular about how I came to the subject. When I began my career, I dreamt of being a foreign correspondent for a major newspaper. Needless to say, no editor was going to hire me, a complete novice, to such a prestigious position. But as luck would have it, a Berlin paper offered me a job as, fashion reporter. As you might imagine, I had absolutely no clue about fashion, but the editor said I would soon pick it up, so I accepted the challenge. One of the joys of my job was that I was allowed to travel to major fashion shows in Paris, London and Milan. To cut a long story short, I was on a steep learning curve. At the end of the 1990s, I started meeting Jewish fashion designers who had once lived and worked in Berlin. They were happy to tell me their stories about life in the 1920s Berlin, the Roaring Twenties, as you have probably heard those years referred to. They gave me a vivid description of new innovative designs and the incredible glamour of the Berlin fashion scene in the Weimar Republic. But they also told me of how they were forced to flee Germany when the Nazis came to power. And before long, I started receiving by mail boxes and documents and photographs, literally from all over the world. I'm really grateful to all those people who so willingly shared their personal stories with me. Without their help, I would never have been able to write my book about the lost history of Jewish fashion companies, which once flourished in Berlin. It is thanks to those documents that I was able to help some claimants negotiate restitution cases in German courts. You will be shocked as I was when I learned how German fashion designers and manufacturers never talked about what happened between 1933 and 1945. Why was there such a deafening silence? Because the German fashion industry profited from the wholesale Nazi confiscations of once Jewish-owned companies. And as beneficiaries of anti-Semitism, the last thing anyone wanted to do was to own up to their participation. It was far better to simply cover it all up and maintain silent. But then I came along. You will hear more about this in my later presentation. Today, a very special thanks to Patty Sherman-Sisler, the Executive Director of Jewish Museum of Milwaukee. First of all, I would like to show you a short video of the place where Jewish fashion in Berlin actually happened, at the Hausvogteiplatz. It's quite a mouthful, but you will get used to the word. It was right in the center of Berlin and how it looks today. Here's a little video of a walk I did last year. So we are here at Berlin Hausvogteiplatz, which was once the old Berlin fashion center. All the shops and firms counted in 1932 were mostly Jewish firms. And this is actually the center of the Hausvogteiplatz, the old fashion center of Berlin. This memorial you can see here was set up by my publisher, by the Jewish community in Berlin in 1992. Don't forget, in 1938, all of these buildings have been raided by Nazi hooligans. They have thrown out index cards, fabrics. They actually forced them to give up their business. So 2,700 companies were in this immediate neighborhood. Nearly all of them were Jewish, and with the Kristallnacht, that was the end of the Jewish Berlin fashion industry. Not a lot of the old buildings are still there, but some. After the 1820s, Jews were officially allowed to produce new garments. They invented efficient sizing systems, and so began Berlin's fashion industry. This building is actually the Valentin Manheimer business office, and they even did fashion shows in here. The Valentin Manheimer coat factory was world famous. The king of coats. He was huge. He had nearly 8,000 employees. The old original gate is still here. You can see the V and the M, Valentin Manheimer. He exported globally. The astonishing boom in the Berlin fashion trade and its emergence as a new dynamic fashion capital drew top fashion designers from Paris. As women became increasingly emancipated, hundreds of fashion magazines stimulated customers to shop at grand new department stores like Nathan Israel, Herrmann Gerson and Valentin Manheimer. Soon, Berlin had around 2,700 fashion retailers and workshops, most of which were Jewish. This is the company building of Leopold Seligman. Seligman left in 1936. He knew that there was no place for Jewish fashion producers in Berlin anymore. He emigrated first to London, and then he moved to the USA, to Albuquerque, and started all over again in the late 1940s. Many others got killed or got deported into the concentration camps. But in 1932, he actually issued a job to a photographer in Berlin, and he did loads of pictures of the interior of the building. Altogether, the Berlin fashion industry had roughly about 90,000 employees, and loads of them actually worked in the suburbs of Berlin, producing clothes for these fashion houses. In 1933, the Nazis turned their focus on Jewish fashion firms. The horrifying speed with which criminal Nazi ideologues and thugs destroyed everything was truly shocking. Many business owners were forced to leave Berlin and their property was confiscated. Progressive fashion was replaced with dull and sterile clothing production. After 1940, Jews were brought to forced labor camps to produce clothing for the military and the Nazi elite. One of the founders of the Berlin fashion industry, David Levine, actually had his company in this building. And Levine actually had to close as well in 1937. And there were probably about 120 Jewish fashion producers in this building. It all started in 1836, and in 1939, because of the Nazis, the Jewish fashion industry was destroyed. And the effects of that are still around, and there aren't any big Jewish fashion producers in Berlin anymore. The entire story you can actually find in my book, Fashion Metropolis Berlin, the story of the rise and destruction of the Jewish fashion industry. Now let's go back to the history of Jewish fashion in Berlin. The narrative starts in two Eastern European provinces of the Jewish shtetl, Galicia and Poznan. Before clothes were produced for mass consumption, fashion was something for the upper class who was happy to spend money on tailored clothing. Rahel van Hagen, a well-known Jewish writer and author, promoted the idea of fashion and liberalism. However, Jews were left out from trading with newly made clothes for a long time. But that was about to change. Over the course of many years, Jewish rag traders established a large network of fabric manufacturers and clothiers, a precondition for the years to come. It was Herrmann Gerson, Valentin Manheimer, and David Levine. These were the founders of Berlin fashion. These three men were the first to understand the opportunity of producing clothes with standardized sizes in a fast-growing Berlin. By 1850, Berlin has dropped the restrictions for Jewish businesses. Berlin was the destination of thousands of Jews who were escaping pogroms. Many of them were tailors and rag traders. Konfektion, i.e. ready-made or ready-to-wear clothing, in Berlin was born. It was a Jewish invention. But what was so special about it? Traditionally, clothes, except for uniforms, were tailored for one person. Jewish tailors, however, developed a mathematical system of various sizes, like the ones we know today, small, medium, and large. The advantage of this production method, clothes could be made for and sold to a large number of people. And Jewish tailors were masters of their craft. Soon, between 1836 and 1850, roughly 50 Jewish firms were established around the city centers, Hausvogteiplatz. Another invention, again a Jewish one and made in the US, was the sewing machine. This was a real game changer. It was essential to producing a large number of standardized clothes in a short time. Making a simple shirt by hand generally took 9 hours, but with sewing machines the work was done in 60 minutes. This innovation was truly revolutionary. But what was the secret to having so many Jewish fashion producers and designers in Berlin and their incredible success in the coming years? The short answer is there was no secret. Jews simply made use of their skills and knowledge of making clothes with the right fabrics. They were the newcomers in a market with enormous opportunities. And they had an excellent feeling for what was liked by the public. They had connections, very good connections, to textile producers worldwide. Copying Paris fashion styles in Berlin was business as usual. Soon, hundreds of designers traveled twice per year from Berlin to the Paris couture shows for new ideas. Fashion spread across Europe and was adapted for the Berliners' taste. Still, buying expensive clothes was a privilege for the upper and middle classes. The liberal political climate and the early stages of the industrialization in the 1860s were preconditions for new fashion trends for less money. Fashion itself became fashionable and accessible. In 1870, the Jewish population in Berlin was 28,000 out of 820,000, or 3%. The early success of ready-made clothes in the years before was boosted by the war against France between 1870 to 71. Germany's victory was directly connected to an economic boom period. The Emperor's Reich was now the second strongest power in Europe. Finally, Jews were freed from nearly all restrictions in regards to their business activities. The French reparations were one of the triggers of the German boom in the early days. French payments gave the German capital market additional impetus and increased the willingness of the middle class to invest. Between 1871 and 1873, around 928 joint stock companies were established. The railways, as well as the steel, coal and mechanical engineering industries benefited in particular, not to forget the fashion industry. Under the influence of Germany's strengthened patriotism and military force, Berlin developed a sense of national pride, far away from any pluralistic liberalism of the 1860s. All fashion designers adopted quickly a rather boring bourgeois style after 1874. The times of luxurious fashion designs were over. However, the Prussian-German soberness was accepted and many firms gave the public what the emperor said. For the growing fashion industry, a kind of perfect climate. Consequently, wearing Paris fashion in Berlin was suddenly unpatriotic and un-German. Buy German was the slogan in the fashion shop windows. Indeed, the war helped to establish new supply chains of plain serialized and somehow modern clothing. This raised a strong interest of new retailers in America, the Netherlands, England, Russia, Scandinavia, Switzerland, and in Paris. Berlin's Jewish fashion firms knew from 4 decades of doing business how to handle large export orders because they had qualified staff and hundreds of seamstresses working in small workshops in the suburbs or from their poorly equipped rental apartments. European retailers of Made in Berlin fashion ordered 250,000 women coats in the summer of 1872. But the economic boom didn't reach the 85% female workers in the Berlin suburbs. Child labor was part of this everyday life. Not infrequently, 15 people lived, slept, worked in the dark rooms of the Berlin tenement barracks. Wages were just a few pennies for 12 or more hours of hard work per day. The Association of Berlin Fashion Wholesalers in 1871 included 600 highly qualified tailors and 6,000 in 60 companies. 78% of those businesses were Jewish owned. We can produce any fashionable item for less than our competitors. That was the motto. In 1875-76, the export businesses generated 10 million marks per year. The rise of Jewish fashion companies was remarkable and kicked off a lucrative business, because many of the fast-growing firms were run by family members. 35-year-old firms often hesitated with the need for new management methods. Prime brands of successful fine dresses and even haute couture companies missed out to re-establish their marketing. One of the exceptions was Herrmann Gerson, who delivered high-class fashion even to the royal families in Greece or even in England. Gerson's Berlin department store was compared with Harrods in London. With 1,500 home workers, Gerson kept his labor costs for the legendary Gerson clothing under control, but not the constantly necessary structural changes. The adoption of the concept of large department stores right in the center of the city, that came from America and England. The leading Berlin department stores were mostly run by Jewish families: Wertheim, Tietz, Mannheimer, Gerson, Nathan Israel, to name just a few. For the Berlin fashion producers, these palaces of goods and fashion offered a unique opportunity to sell new clothes fast and with lots of marketing in an elaborate, nearly theatrical interior design decorating the glamour. That was the time when potential customers used their Sunday family outings and walks to the shopping windows, admiring the splendor of the new world of goods. People loved it, and they loved the seasonal fashion shows. They didn't care who owned the shops. They were just very curious. Without the department stores, Berlin confection, and therefore the mass consumption of clothing, wouldn't have been so successful. In the midst of this optimistic mood for more and larger business opportunities, envious and politically motivated agitators came forward with increasing frequency. Anti-Jewish political organizations, newspapers stigmatized Jewish fashion firms and designers as morally corrupt or a danger to German economic decency. Exactly the key words the Nazis picked up in 1933. They were targeted by anti-Jewish campaigners against fashion brands and large department stores in the 1890s. Political right-wing and nationalist movements focused on Jewish fashion producers and their shops in Berlin after 1873. Prejudices, the envy of economic success, and the attempt to make life difficult for Jewish competitors were widespread in Prussian conservative political circles. The Association of Aryan Businesses called for a boycott of non-Aryan clothing. In 1899, anti-Semitic political parties became a regular feature in the Prussian parliament. Jewish fashion producers stood very often in the center of media reports. Regular stories about the elaborate lifestyle of wealthy confectionsmillionaires created many new slurs against the Jews. The magazine Anti-Semitic Correspondence wrote, "Innocent German citizens do not even suspect how far the influence of the Israelite alliance and the resulting Jewification of Germany reaches. Fashion is dictated to us by the Jews." Prejudice, irrationality, envy, and aggressive anti-Semitism broke fresh ground during this time. Still, new fashion firms and shops by young and modern fashion designers, Jewish fashion designers, gained popularity. One of the reasons for that, beside the need for more fashionable clothing, was the new transparency of the pricing of the clothes and new garments and the choice of new sizes. The anti-Semitic attacks came from those who felt left behind in the tough competition for the new fashion world in the 1920s. However, the number of Jewish-owned small and medium fashion enterprises dropped continuously since 1900, down to 48% of all new businesses in the 1920s. But in general, the ready-to-wear enterprises remain financially strong due to foreign export orders. The peak of Jewish fashion firms was over. Non-Jewish fashion corporations participated in the run for new customers in a highly lucrative and competitive market. The total turnover of all international orders of women's coats in 1913 was 121 million marks. In comparison, Gerson's annual turnover was about 30 million. Jewish garment producers dominated the exports of Berlin chic, with roughly about 78%. Exporting Berlin fashion was for Jewish companies financially far more interesting than the domestic market. But remaining anti-Semitic resentments triggered new attacks against well-known Jewish brands. The Jewish members of the Association of German Fashion Producers tried to stop the stigmatization of Jews by demonstrating loyalty as German patriots. The CEOs of Gerson and Mannheimer called for the emancipation of German fashion from Paris. Their hope was to calm down the concerted attacks against them. With the end of the First World War in 1918 and the declaration of the Weimar Republic, fashion designers re-established new and innovative firms, a hub for what was called, or we would call it today, start-ups in fashion. Hausvogteiplatz was accessible by public transportation and close train stations. Both were crucially important for the export business and the nearly 83,000 employees who took the subway and the buses to get to work and back home every day. By 1925, Hausvogteiplatz remained the center of Jewish Berlin fashion. Just like New York had the Garment Center and Paris the Haute Couture. This time was more pride and self-assurance. Now, Berlin's fashion industry was the second largest industry in the city. Trends and fashion styles changed fast. Jewish fashion producers helped liberating women in a rather dull society. The so-called reform fashion created a democratic sense of clothing. Nathan Israel's superstore was the largest and the leading fashion trendsetter in Berlin. Artists stimulated fashion and vice versa. Fashion became an integrated part of the intellectual and artistic life in Berlin. Now here's a little video clip from the Golden 20s, and there you get a sense of how important fashion in everyday life in Berlin actually was. Between 1850 and 1920, Berlin fashion became a globally known brand. Berlin fashion companies employed 90,000 tailors and seamstresses in and around the city. Fashion was the second largest industry in Berlin. Jewish participation in the entire fashion industry peaked in 1890 with about 85%, a unique development. Or, as the New York Times fashion correspondent Vanessa Friedman wrote last year, it's hard to believe Jews dominated the fashion industry in Prussia. The declaration of the German Republic in 1918 ended World War I. Germany lost the war but gained economic power, and so did a new generation of fashion companies. Young and modern Jewish fashion designers with start-up enterprises quickly dominated the market in Germany again and exported around the globe what was by that time called Berlin chic. New and stylish fashion magazines sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Berlin in the golden 20s was a center of innovation and creativity in art and fashion. It all centered around the Hausvogteiplatz and the nearby streets. Here we see three original drawings, fashion drawings of the company Loeb and Levy, designed by Lissy Edler. Loeb and Levy had their workshops and store in Krausenstraße. Berlin's art world, theater, popular music and cinema, dance clubs and glamour shows inspired fashion trends, and vice versa. Actresses like Marlene Dietrich and Josephine Baker bought and showcased Berlin fashion. Berlin became a hub of entertainment and style. But anti-Semitic political right-wing parties started campaigning against the participation of Jews in fashion, which now dropped to 45%. The global economic crisis in 1928-29 contributed to that. Modern 1920s fashion was suddenly stigmatized as Jewish and decadent. Nazis hated liberal fashion designs. As you all know, Hitler continuously consolidated his power. Jewish fashion companies were put under a lot of pressure, and in the years to come until January 1993. Essentially, everything that made Berlin fashion so exciting was rejected by the Nazis. Suddenly, Berlin's ready-to-wear and popular pret-à-porter industry was stigmatized by the Nazis as undeutsch, un-German. The first boycotts against Jewish firms started in April 1933. Most Jewish fashion firms and owners had survived the world economic crisis in 1929, and they were hoping that the Nazi period would end shortly. As we all know, that didn't happen. By 1936, 290 Jewish fashion companies and their owners had left Berlin for the Netherlands and the UK. It was the expressed goal of the Nazi Ministry of Economics and Hitler to confiscate all Jewish fashion companies in Berlin. To this purpose, ADEFA, A-D-E-F-A, was created. It was an association of so-called German fashion producers. ADEFA was a privately run association of German fashion producers, which meant that no Jews were permitted as members. ADEFA was the Nazis' tool to confiscate Jewish property and companies in Berlin and the German Reich. ADEFA had nearly 4,000 member firms, excellent connections to bank loans, insurances, the city's administration and the Department of Economy. Soon, ADEFA started campaigning against Jewish firms. Large Jewish fashion companies with high export numbers were still working and generating profit in 1936, the year of the Olympic Games in Berlin, like Leopold Seligman, just round the corner of Housekeeping. The photographs you are going to see are the only pictures of an operating top Jewish fashion firm in 1932. So why did the Nazis actually focus so intensively on the Berlin fashion industry? There were two reasons. One, 2,700 Jewish fashion companies represented capital and real estate in the center of Berlin, close to the headquarters of Hitler's government departments. In 1940, just 76 of them were left. And the reason number two, the objective of the Nazis was to confiscate Jewish property and turn Housekeeping buildings into NS party offices. ADIFA was the organization acting on behalf of the Nazi government. Forced sales and liquidation of Jewish companies were the result. The so-called Nuremberg laws were already in place. Jews had no longer the right to run businesses. All bank loans were cancelled, an impossible situation to operate a fashion company that depended on credits. The November pogroms during the so-called Crystal Night were just the culmination of the systematic persecution and government-run theft of Jewish capital in Berlin and in Germany. I've spoken to people that actually have been around at Housekeeping on the days of the 9th and the 10th of November in 1938. And here's one eyewitness report, a short excerpt out of that. Around 11 a.m., several young men entered our workshops wearing swastika armbands. We saw through the windows that some Nazi thugs were trying to burn coats and dresses from our collection in the center of the backyard. Our boss had been beaten. He had to be treated in a hospital. I knew from that moment I can't stay in Berlin any longer. The eyewitness, by the way, shortly after this happened in November 1938, escaped the Nazis for England, for London. In 1939, nearly 98% of all Jewish firms in Berlin were confiscated, closed or taken over by Nazi-loyal fashion designers and NSDAP party members. Some of those who formerly owned the corporations emigrated or were first imprisoned and later sent to concentration camp and forced labor camps. Now, German fashion was produced in roughly 18 slave labor camps close to the concentration camps. Here's a minute of rare silent video footage from the Betzin slave labor camp. Betzin was a very small town in the immediate neighborhood of Auschwitz. This was filmed by a Nazi propaganda unit. Did the German public know about this? Did they know who produced the clothes they were wearing? Well, it was no secret. The remaining Berlin Jewish fashion companies, now without Jews, ordered from ghetto slave labor what they actually wanted. And here is a letter that has been written to a slave labor camp, and a Berlin Aryan fashion designer actually ordered the clothes right out of that slave labor camp. The company was now called Roll Fashion. The former owner was Leopold Lindemann, who had to leave Berlin for London. One company, among many others, was Hugo Boss, the Führer's tailor, as they were called. Boss deported seamstresses from Betzin to their forced labor camp in Metzingen in Bavaria. Between 1942 and 1945, the Allies had destroyed Berlin, including the fashion industry. The Jews were gone, emigrated or murdered. The entire area of Hausvogteiplatz was destroyed by Allied bombing raids. To understand, let's have a quick look back to understand how the confiscation of Jewish property actually worked between 1933 and 1939. Here are two examples of leading and cutting-edge fashion firms in Berlin. Example one is Leopold Seligman. He emigrated to London in 1936. Seligman was a producer of large numbers of garments, mainly for export to Europe and Latin America. He was hoping to receive at least 25% of that forced sale of his firm. He never received it. He left London before the World War II, later then for Mexico. Seligman established a very successful new company in Albuquerque. It was a Western and country-style clothing, a rather unusual career, but he was enormously successful and it worked for him. Pioneer Wear in Albuquerque was actually his brand, a company that existed still in the late 1970s. And they supplied the clothing for somebody you probably know from the advertising. It was the Marlboro Man. He dressed that. Seligman died in 1946. His children took over the firm and made Pioneer Wear a huge success. My second example is another leading and cutting-edge fashion firm in Berlin, and that was run by Norbert Euchenka. Originally, Euchenka came from Krakow. He was recognized for his modern and uncompromised couture style. Here we see a photograph of Norbert Euchenka and his wife Lieselotte in front of a plane in 1937 in Berlin. Norbert Euchenka was put under pressure to sell his company with 120 staff members. He knew he had no chance to save his business. In 1938, he agreed a forced sale, 86% below the estimated value. He emigrated with his wife to New York City. And there, Norbert Euchenka changed his name to Norbert J.J.A.Y. and rekindled his success in 498 7th Avenue in Manhattan. His designs were called by the media in New York the Renaissance of fashion, and it was compared with the superstar of fashion couture with Schiaparelli's couture style. Norbert Euchenka's Berlin business assets and remaining bank accounts were confiscated by the fraudulent successor of Euchenka. He never received restitution and he died in New York in 1954. Now let's have a quick recap of what happened. The Jewish fashion industry was destroyed and so was German fashion. Nearly all talent was killed or had left Germany for good. Hausvogteiplatz was bombed out, and due to the four occupying Allied powers, Berlin was divided in four sectors. Hausvogteiplatz and the surrounding area belonged suddenly to the Soviet sector. The Cold War and the Berlin Wall after 1961 divided the city for the next 30 years. But 1945 was not the end of the story. German fashion designers in post-war West Berlin established new careers on the back of former Jewish fashion firms. In 1948, the US Allied Berlin commander stated, "It is incredible how quickly Berlin fashion recovered from the war." But how did that happen? West Berlin's population wanted to forget what happened during the Nazi years. New fashion and consumerism were helping them. Fashion designers who once worked as apprentices for Jewish firms saw their great opportunity. Jewish competitors were all gone, either murdered or emigrated. East Berlin had no fashion scene at all. GDR clothing factories worked for West German mail order suppliers, and that was big business. And then, and you all know this, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. In 1992, I took the initiative with my publisher and the Jewish community to establish a memorial for the Jewish fashion designers at Hausvogteiplatz. And here's the memorial, consisting of 3 mirrors and also for the names of most of the companies that have been destroyed and confiscated at that particular place in Berlin. The steps to the underground station actually carry the names of these firms. So that is just a memorial we have seen, but that shouldn't be all of it. How is the situation in Berlin today? The Berlin Fashion Week and the German Fashion Council, supported by the government, still refuse to remember how the Jewish fashion industry was stolen and destroyed by the Nazis, and how they have profited from a Jew-free fashion scene in Berlin. No fashion designer award exists in the name of the Jewish founders of fashion in Berlin in 1830. In fact, most young Berlin fashion designers today have no idea about the Jewish roots and the tradition of the once glorious times of fashion in the city. Berlin is still suffering the loss of talent that once was there. Something that the young Karl Lagerfeld knew very well when he left Berlin for Paris. More recently, young fashion designers from Israel actually flocked to Berlin with fantastic and new start-up fashion ideas. But Berlin has never recovered its fashion glory, not yet. Nor has it fully admitted its role in destroying the once famous and creative fashion industry. And Jews have built that. There is no way around. It is a historical fact. So I have tried for many years to tell a nearly forgotten story. And that's why I wrote my recently published book. I think a younger generation should really understand the connection between the Holocaust and the destruction of the Berlin fashion industry. That was my intention, and I hope it actually has worked. You will be the judge to decide that. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so wow, that was an incredibly powerful presentation, and I know a lot of time and effort went into to assembling that. So thank you, Uwe and Cassie, and I know some of our interns who worked on the captions for that. Incredibly powerful. So as Cassie has indicated, we would love for you to put your questions into the chat, and Uwe is here with us live and will be answering some of those questions. So I know we already have some coming in. So I'm gonna start from the top here, which is a question about the image of the flapper and where that originated. Is that, a German, is that something that originated in Berlin, in Paris, in New York? Where did that flapper image come from?
It actually was a New York invention, I have to admit it. And but Paris actually picked up on this very quickly, and so did Berlin, as Berlin was always very good in basically stealing a few good ideas from Paris and from New York and from London. But of course, it was distributed very quickly in Berlin, became very, very fashionable. And of course, the film industry picked up on this.
Exactly. So interesting. You had, of course, talked about kind of the evolution of some of the designers, the name brands. One in particular, you had mentioned Hugo Boss, which may be a contemporary name that many recognize. So the question is, so yeah, it looks like you just answered that. So is Hugo Boss related to the World War II company? And it is in fact the same company? That's what you're saying?
Well, look, after all these years, these companies have been internationalized, and so did Hugo Boss, and they have been basically passed on to larger consortiums. But in fact, the core of the company is still in Metzingen, in that little place close to the Bavarian border. And they still have a policy that they do not open their archives to all researchers. So they select their researchers. It's a bit like what, for example, the insurance company Victoria Insurance does still today. So there is a selection of, who is allowed into our archives and who is not. And they deal with this in a very, well, not sophisticated way, for me, a very obvious way how they deal with that, because they don't want to get pulled into restitution cases. And they are still Polish forced labor workers, and their families, they still suffer because of family members have been drawn into this forced labor camp in Germany for Hugo Boss. The company at its core, it's still the same company, and I don't want to lean out myself too much into this subject because they have large lawyer firms working for them.
Right.
But I'm working at this subject, and the last word hasn't been said about this.
Okay. Well, you have been so tenacious in your approaches. I mean, in looking at your book and, some of the reasons that you became interested in this, which of course ties into some of your family history as well. But I kind of am touching on some of the comments here in terms of, this kind of refusal on behalf of the Berlin fashion industry to confront or acknowledge the past as far as the decimation of the Jewish industry and their innovations and contributions. And that's something that continues. So you had mentioned, that you had written some articles in 1985 that had been published in Berlin publications that kind of coincided with Fashion Week. And the response was terrifying. It was vicious, you say. There were comments to the editors. You were receiving threats. And that really ties into what you've just said in terms of not having access to archives, contemporary Berlin fashion, moguls or people in the industry having no knowledge of the history of the Jewish fashion industry. And the fact that while so many German companies have in fact confronted and acknowledged the history as far as, the Jewish community is concerned, the fashion industry has absolutely not. And can you comment on why do you think that is? What do you think is behind this kind of veil that they are insisting on trying to keep in place?
This is a question I ask myself basically every second week, again and again, when there is another scandal about forced labor, slave labor workshops in Asia. And suddenly there is another scandal that people get killed in these slave labor workshops in Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and some other places. And the fashion industry has got developed, and I would say internationally, a certain kind of ignorance about these things. They can talk a lot about sustainability and clothes you should wear more than once and all the rest of it. You shouldn't buy cheap clothes, da 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 da. But fact is, in Germany, and this is my subject, because I looked how it developed actually after 45, I find it puzzling that the main institutions, the lobbyists for the industry, are ignoring this entire subject completely. There is a wall of silence around this. And they will continue doing this until probably the last eyewitness is dead or nothing, or nobody actually wants to talk about it. But I can promise you one thing, this is not going to happen. They will have to face the reality. And that is something, this is why I published my book. And this is now a fact of life, Somebody who wants to know about this can find out, and it is becoming slowly also a little bit more common knowledge what the German fashion industry actually did. The crime, the killings, the contribution to the Holocaust, to the slave labor camps, you can't put that simply beside. This is just not on. It's morally completely and utterly rotten. And I'm going to do some more work on my job, publishing.
Well, I mean, we are, indebted to you for your work and the work that you continue to do, because as you point out, unless someone is willing to really put themselves out there and, continue to keep or bring this subject, to visibility and to keep a light shining on it, if that continues to happen, it can't be ignored. It can't be ignored. And one of the other things that I wanted to mention, which of course several in our audience have picked up on, and some of us are familiar with, the irony of the fact that there was all this propaganda about the Jewish fashion industry, the clothes, all of it, and here they are using Jewish slave labor in the camps to use their process, their innovations. They're working on, the sewing machine that was a Jewish innovation from the US. They fully were aware of the fact that the Jews were the top of, the line in terms of knowledge. And so they were intentionally sought out by higher ups in the SS who, were wanting to have their haute couture, their personally, designed pieces. I mean, just the complete irony of it all, that it's, on the one hand, the public is being told it's not worthy, they are not worthy, and on the other hand, that is what is the public is being supplied with is, or the German SS are being supplied with, are pieces created by Jewish slave labor based on their innovations. And the fact that that continues to be part of that unacknowledged history is just extraordinary. So, I mean, we truly are indebted to you for the work that you continue to do. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you are doing moving forward in terms of the research of this subject?
You see, the beauty of this book, which is, of course, published in English, is that there are more researchers, university professors. They read about this and they do their own research. And we more or less all have some kind of an informal network and where we exchange information. And just about a few months ago, for me, it was the first time, although I knew about the forced labor camps close to Auschwitz, but what I didn't know was that there was a fashion salon in Auschwitz created by the SS. And this is something an English researcher actually has found out, which is kind of incredible. The other side of doing more research is that a colleague of mine, Dina Gold, she has actually managed to get restitution. I think it was in 91, 92, for her granddad's and mother's firm in Berlin. And there are many more people that actually they are entitled to restitution, but it is a very, very complicated and difficult process these days. And there are many more. They are actually asking for this. And the problem is, getting it all together. But the network I mentioned is a very useful instrument in order to do more research and spread the word about what we know. And that counts for the US, for the UK, for Holland, for France, and some other places. It's very important to do this.
Incredibly important work. And Dina Gold has actually put into the comments here that in 1996, after much research digging into archives, it's still been very hard to find the documents to prove the cases, but all over Europe, there are people still trying for restitution. I'm curious how many of those, because as you say, that's an incredibly complex, process, which I'm sure would be a hurdle for many may just turn away based on the complexity of that. I know that part of your research, particularly, going from 1985 forward, was putting advertisements into, papers and publications in Israel and Europe, to search for eyewitnesses who are sharing their stories. Do you know if there are, members of families, younger generations that are pursuing restitution? Do you know about any other cases where those are active?
I know from cases they would like to file a legal case, but it's going to be even more difficult because in 91, 92, there was the Allied Powers Conference in Berlin, and international Jewish organization have participated in that. And there was some kind of, well, I say this, there was a sum of money. These were millions and millions of dollars. They have been designed for those cases, and the International Jewish Organization actually took over the cases they wanted to, or from single cases they wanted to run in German courts. But the German courts actually pulled out of this by saying, we have done our duty. The state, German state, has paid so and so many millions of dollars, and now we don't want to have anything to do with this anymore. But fact is that if you read about these cases, there are families in Greece, Jewish families in Greece, they are now actually filing for restitution. It is difficult. It's a very difficult thing, and I think it would be actually quite a very interesting session to have that online and or maybe at a museum to talk about these restitution cases. It's very, very interesting to see how it actually developed.
It's absolutely fascinating. And really, so heartbreaking and frustrating.
Absolutely,
on so many levels. When you hear about these hurdles that are still in place.
Yeah.
You mentioned, that archives are only shared with, selected individuals. So in terms of other researchers trying to, continue research on this topic, what are the legalities surrounding making those archives accessible to a broader swath of researchers?
Oh, Molly, this is a rather simple procedure. A company, let's say an international company like Allianz, insurance companies, banks, they simply declare their archives as private. And that's the end, or more or less the end of the story. And the usual procedure is they declare the archive as private. Step number 2 is you hire 2 academic researchers. They write a book that has 850, 1,000 pages, and then it's published, and then it says Deutsche Bank has actually put open all the documents they have, but I have my doubts that they actually come up with all the documents they have, and so that is the case with many other companies. But as it is, you know, after so many years, companies get sold or they go insolvent or whatever, you know, it's even more difficult to get to the documents where you can actually prove that my granddad has, for example, worked in a slave labor camp at Hugo Boss. You have to prove this in a court case, which is very difficult sometimes.
Yeah, it is incredibly complex, but utterly fascinating. And I just want to thank you so much for all the work that you were doing and for sharing your knowledge with us and for continuing to delve into this topic. It's truly just been so fascinating and an honor to have this conversation with you and to, you know, to know that this research continues. It's so important. So thank you, Uwe.
Thank you
So much. I know that Cassie has put in the link there. We of course have this book for sale, both in the museum in person and the online store. If you are interested, we encourage you to purchase it. It is just a fascinating read. Clearly disturbing, but fascinating, and just such an incredible body of information. So we encourage you to do that. I want to thank our audience again for being with us. And again, thank you to our sponsors for making this possible. And for those of you who have donated or are going to donate to help us to continue to offer these programs, we thank you profusely for those efforts of support. So I just want to mention a few upcoming events. First of all, our current exhibit, To Paint is to Live, the artwork of Eric Lichtblau-Leslie, is up through May 30th. So just a couple more weeks. We encourage you to come in and see this show if you have not yet had an opportunity. And we also continue with our Global Museum Passport Virtual Edition series on June 10th, with a virtual trip to the South African Jewish Museum to look at the history of that community there. It should be fascinating. And that is taking place at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. You can visit our website to get more information about all of our upcoming programs and how to register and to get access through to the Zoom sessions. So thank you so very much. Thank you again to Uwe. It's been an absolute privilege to have this conversation, and we look forward to seeing our audience in the museum and on the screen. And have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll look forward to being.
Thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.